Book 6 and 7 of the Republic are in some ways the high point of this dialogue. It's in Book 6 and 7 that Plato presents us with his ontological and epistemological doctrines, which have been largely assumed tacitly in the earlier part of the discussion of justice and the ideal city and the philosopher king. Book 6 extends the third wave, the wave of argument which threatens to overwhelm the Socratic city, the impossibility of the philosopher king, the impracticality of the ideal city, is one of the main concerns of Socrates, or Socrates' discussion and Plato's discussion of this new kind of ideal justice. And in Book 6, we continue the problem of the impossibility of the ideal city in this physical world. The world of space and time, Plato wants to suggest, is radically incomplete or unsatisfactory. There's something wrong with what we call everyday reality. So what he's going to drive at is that there's another reality, a second realm, not a different area in the sense of space and time, but a place or a world outside of space and time entirely. And true justice, true beauty, truth itself exists in this realm outside of space and time. So Plato wants to tell us in some ways what the great mystics have tried to tell us, that the world of the senses is the veil of Maya, it's the veil of illusion, it's not real. It's somehow less perfect, less certain, less permanent than a second realm, the realm of mind, the realm of thought, the realm of pure ideas, which is independent of and separate from this world of space and time. So Plato asks us to make a leap. And he wants the leap to be that if somehow his idealizations, his perfect cities and perfect philosophers and perfect rulers won't fit into this world of space and time, that means that there's something very seriously wrong with space and time itself. All right? This world around us is not real, or not as real as the ideal realm he's going to construct. So Book 6 talks about the philosopher king and gives us one of the great paradoxes in Platonic philosophy. Not till philosophers are kings will we have a good city. The difficulty is that no empirical city wants philosophers to run things. There's no regime that is looking for a philosopher to come in and run things. Philosophers are thought of as being corrupt and corrupting. Remember that Socrates is condemned for corrupting the youth of Athens, for teaching the wrong kinds of religious beliefs, and philosophers don't seem to be the appropriate sort of person to run a city. Most Greeks are thinking back to the Homeric hero. You want to think of a king, think of Agamemnon. There's a real king for you. But Socrates would not be any Greek's idea of a good ruler. So Socrates has to justify the idea that philosophers ought to be kings, and the hard part, once you explain the argument, is not persuading people to bring the philosopher into the city, but rather persuading the philosopher to take on the job of being the king. Remember, one of the funny ironies of this book is that we've established justice by making sure that there's one man, one job. Everyone pursues only one course in life, except for the best and most wise person in the city, the philosopher king. Because to be a philosopher is not the same thing as being a king. He's the only person that has two jobs. So apparently the justest man in the city, the man with the most wisdom and the most philosophical insight, is also the person who we force, due to our own necessity, to engage in a kind of injustice, to pursue more than one job. It's one of the crowning ironies of the Republic. Well, in defending the philosopher, Socrates also argues that the real corrupter of the people, the real corrupter of youth, is Athens itself. In other words, the philosopher is the one who saves and reclaims and improves the people that listen to him. The city is what causes these corruptions, brings in these innovations, generates all kinds of skepticism and immorality. The sophists just work for the demos of the city. They're just employees. If the sophists, these tyrannical men with great souls, had been given a good education, they would be potential philosopher kings. In other words, the similarity of soul between Socrates and Thrasymachus, there's a similarity in the depth or the profundity of their souls. The difference really amounts to the fact that Socrates, by divine dispensation or maybe the daimon or something, has gotten these philosophical insights, has gotten a philosophical education, I guess a self-education. Whereas Thrasymachus, because he has been denied these insights, with his great soul, goes to the greatest of extremes. What is it in Paradise Lost, where Satan is one of the greatest of angels and then falls, and when the greatest fall, they fall all the way. So that's true of all the sophists. They they are great souls with bad educations. And not only bad educations, but they pander to the city. In an oligarchic city, they pander to the oligarchy. In a democratic city, they pander to the people. But in every case, they are just employees. The real corruption doesn't come from sophists or philosophers. The real corruption comes from the people themselves in every city. Ignorance is the source of all corruption and evil. Now, if we're going to have a philosopher king, we have to figure out how to educate a philosopher king, what he'll have to know, and how he'll be different from the defenders, the silver people in society. And what we're going to do is have to figure out what it is that the philosopher king knows that everybody else doesn't know. And what he knows, it turns out, is the form of the good. The form of the good is the true, changeless, atemporal, aspatial goodness in which all other good things in the world somehow participate. And what Plato gives us at the end of Book 6 is something called the divided line, which is an ontological and epistemological doctrine which tries to explain the kind of universe or the different kinds of things that the universe contains in Plato's view. Okay? So we're going to have to, there are 4 basic divisions in it. We'll start at the bottom of it. The bottom, the least real things, are things like shadows. When I put my hand up and it catches these lights, there's a shadow cast on the back wall. Well, the shadow is very different from my hand. And the shadow is somehow less real than my hand. Well, Plato thinks that the least real things are what we might call images. And this realm, this bottom, least real set of things include images like shadows. Also, if you hold up a mirror to someone, the image of your face in the mirror is somehow less than your face itself. So that's a kind of an image. But there are other kinds of images too, and this is quite worthy of note. Poetry and painting and sculpture are all the creation of images. This is very important. It helps explain why it is that Plato places the poets well down on the scale of knowledge and reality. Poetry, in the extended sense of constructing a representation, right, and which would include sculpture and painting and music, for example, poetry is an image in the same way that a shadow or your reflection in a pool of water is an image. And these things are even less real than the objects of sense perception around us. So at the very bottom of the divided line, the very bottom in the realm of being, we have images, which includes all of the arts, plus things like shadows and mirror images. What we do when we cogitate, when we mentally arrest and absorb and envelop these images, is Plato calls imagination. In other words, and to imagine is a very specific and definite mental activity, an activity of the soul in which we apprehend. When we listen to poems by Homer, we imagine Hector and Achilles fighting it out. When we look at a painting, we imagine the scene represented by the painting, but in fact it's just a set of pigments on a piece of paper or on a piece of canvas. Right? So we do a definite mental activity. There's a definite state of the soul which corresponds to this particular kind of thing and to the other 3 different kinds of thing. Now, one up on the divided line, above images like shadows and poems, we have objects of sense perception. Now here's a funny thing about sense perception. Plato doesn't think it's reliable. And maybe if you lived in 400 BC, you would find sense perception unreliable as well. Remember that he doesn't have modern natural science and the technological and logical triumphs of modern natural science to make him feel comfortable with the world of the senses. He lives in a world where we don't have an accurate or adequate or satisfactory theory of the world of space and time, and for that reason he thinks it's uncertain. For example, imagine, for the ancient Greeks, what the problem of the mirage must have been like. You know what a mirage is? When you are in the desert and you see in the distance a lake of water, and then you walk to that lake of water, and there's nothing there. Now Plato is going to ask you, if he happens to be around, where'd it go? And if you don't have anything intelligent to say, he's going to ask you, well, why do you feel comfortable then with basing your understanding of the world on your sense perceptions, which are often illusory, often mistaken? Right? Think about mirages. Think about putting a pencil in a glass of water and the idea of refraction by water. So the pencil looks bent and then when you take it out it turns out to be straight. We don't have any way of accounting for that. Plato thinks that there are a whole bunch of examples of sense perception that are just unreliable. Now, if you're willing to accept the idea that some sense perceptions are unreliable, well, I feel pretty certain about this podium in front of me, but how do I know it's not going to behave like that very odd body of water in the desert? In other words, the next time I wrap my knuckles on it, how do I know it's still going to be there? Plato thinks you really can't. And in fact, there is no logical way of being certain that the podium is still going to be there next time. And it's still going to have the properties of that it had the first time I touched it. So Plato is going to argue and it's particularly plausible because of the state of Greek science, that sense perceptions are not a satisfactory basis for a theory of knowledge. So what he's going to say is that the whole realm of the senses are subject to change, they come into being and they go out of being, and you really can't know the objects of sense perception in the same way, and for pretty much the same reason you really can't know poetic images or shadows. They're not real enough to have real knowledge. The best you're going to have of these objects of sense perception is beliefs. And some of them may be handy. In other words, I recommend that when you walk out the door, that you open the door first. Right? Because it's made of wood and you're going to hurt yourself. But that's, in Plato's sense, that's just a belief. Who knows? Maybe this will be the funny door that you can walk right through. I mean, we saw what happened in the desert with the lake, right? It was there and then it disappeared. Maybe when we walk up to the threshold of the door, maybe the door will disappear too. You can't be sure that it won't. And that's Plato's ace in the hole. You can't really be sure. So he's going to say, look, I'm looking for absolute certainty. There's another thing to emphasize when you read Plato. Plato doesn't want to be almost right. He came to play. He wants absolute certainty that's logically demonstrable, and he wants to take no nonsense about it. And since the realm of the senses just doesn't offer us any absolute certainty, then it's not going to be satisfactory to Plato. Now, hearken back to the end of my last lecture. When I said that this realm of space and time, it seems like there's a gap between theory and practice, and his perfect city and his philosopher king can't exist down here. Well, Plato thinks that just shows you how inferior this world of space and time is. In other words, his theory is right, and if the world won't accommodate it, then the world is wrong, which is a deeply crazy thought. I mean, if you think about it long enough, it becomes kind of funny. I mean, although Plato is sublime and beautiful and profound, I mean, that opens the door in some ways to all kinds of crazy stuff. The world is wrong. Well, there are a lot of people, you know, who have been locked up on account of that. Plato, on the other hand, offers us an alternative way of interpreting our everyday sense experience. He says, look, don't place too much value on that. That's mere body. Think about soul. Think about mind. Think about pure logic. When we move up the divided line, now those first two categories, the realm of shadows, the realm of images, and the next realm, which is the realm of sense perception, you know, objects, tables and chairs, things like that, Plato wants to take both of those together and say those two categories of thing, you can have some opinions about those things, but you really can't know them. So in other words, representations and sense perceptions are not objects of knowledge. Now, this is going to help him out. That means that no wonder you can't really know this external world. The things that you can really know are outside of space and time altogether. And here's where Plato plays his ace in the hole, mathematics. Mathematics is God's gift to Platonists. Whenever you argue with a Platonist, if the Platonist knows of his business, he's going to start talking to you about arithmetic. Because you can't weasel out when you start talking about arithmetic. You can't get all relativistic and say, well, you believe this, I believe that. He's just going to bring you right back to the number line. He's not going to take any nonsense from you. When Plato has to go to his strong suit, he always goes to a mathematical example. When you are reading the dialogues, if you see Plato start to talk about arithmetic or about geometry or about some other mathematical entity, underline that section, because Plato is going for the kill. When he wants to win an argument, he goes with math and then goes for the pin. So when we move up out of the realm of space and time, Plato wants us to believe that the next thing up, the next category, the category that moves us from a mere opinion to real knowledge, is mathematics. Mathematics is real knowledge. Triangles, numbers like 7 and 3, various kinds of mathematical relationships like parallel and intersection can be defined in every and only ways, in exactly the way that Plato wants things defined. Because you've got to remember, he's derived his conception of a real definition, of a satisfactory definition, from mathematics. If you want to define a triangle, you specify some quality that every triangle has and only triangles have. And then once Socrates realizes that he likes this kind of mathematical reasoning because it's true and permanent and unchanging, well, then he tries to force everything into the mathematical mold. If you want to talk about virtue, then he says, well, define it the way you define a triangle. If you want to define justice, let's say, what does every justice have, every instantiation of it, and only instantiations of justice have? So he wants to define it the way he does math. Mathematics is God's gift to Platonists. So the next step up, when we move from opinion to knowledge on the divided line, we move to mathematical objects, objects like triangles, squares, sevens, that don't change and that are susceptible to precise, demonstrable, logical analysis. And you can really think about these things. You don't just have opinions about triangles. If you think about something like the theorem of Pythagoras, that's the way right triangles are. And next year when we bring 10th graders into a geometry class, we're going to teach them that. And if some 10th grader puts up his hand and says, no, I don't think it works this way, we're going to say, well, look, you don't understand what we mean by a triangle. You don't understand what we mean by a right angle. You don't understand what we mean by a hypotenuse. Somewhere along the line, you don't understand something because the theorem of Pythagoras, once proven, that's just the way right triangles are. That's the kind of knowledge Plato wants. In other words, once we get it, it's a permanent possession forever. Plato wants to stop all change, all flux, all becoming. Our knowledge must be fixed and permanent, godlike and divine, not merely human. Mathematics is the bridge that allows us to move from the realm of space and time to the realm of the forms. This realm of the forms, this area up outside of space and time, is the container of the permanent, true, real objects of knowledge. And mathematical objects are the most immediately accessible, most immediately comprehensible kinds of entity that are outside of space and time. Think about, and there's some truth to this, or at least you can understand how you might come up with an idea like this. Think about the square root of -1. We can make logical statements about that. For example, the square root of -1 equals the square root of -1. That's a mathematical fact. But there's no instantiation of that in the world. There is no square root of -1. There's no quantity that corresponds to that in the physical world. Plato says, so what? That shows you what's wrong with the physical world. It doesn't correspond to these perfect mathematical ideas. Well, he says, let's go with the perfection. Let's go with being instead of becoming. Let's go with true reality. So Plato is trying to ground all of reasoning on the distrust of sense perception and the trust or belief in mathematical logical analysis. All right? Now, from mathematics, the next step up, and this is why everyone that gets a Platonic education has to know quite a bit of math. Over the academy, at the gate it said, let no one enter who has not studied geometry. If you want to go and study Platonic philosophy, you have to know your geometry, because that's the big paradigm of knowledge. Well, the next thing up, and the final stage, once we move into the realm of knowledge and being altogether, is the realm of the forms. The final, the most real thing, the most completely permanent things are the forms. And form is sometimes translated as idea, idios, and what it means is some image, some entity in which all of the examples of that quality in this world correspond or participate. Let me give you an example. This is a book, or it's a book of Plato. There are other books on the table in front of me. The reason why we call this a book, and that a book, and that a book, even though they don't perfectly correspond, they take up different points in space, they have different covers, they have different qualities in many respects. The reason why we use the term book for all of these things is that this book and that book and the other book all participate in the form of bookness up in the realm of the forms. That allows us to account for why we call this a book and that a book and the other thing a book. All of you are sitting on chairs. These chairs differ slightly. The reason why we can call each of these different things chairs is because they all participate in the big form of chairness up in the realm of the forms. In other words, Plato thinks that the realm of the forms helps account for the fact that language brings together, under certain common terms, a completely heterogeneous set of sense perceptions. Right? Why is the First World War and the Second World War and the Civil War and the Peloponnesian War all called wars? What the hell do they have in common? There are different parts of the world. One gets fought with a sword, the other gets fought with an atomic bomb. Why do we call them all wars? Well, Plato thinks because they all participate in the form of warness. In other words, you take some abstract quality like squares. Let's take that as an example. Now, when your geometry teacher draws a square on the blackboard, here's an important fact. It's not really a square. He says that let's consider this as a square, but if you were to actually look with a microscope at that chalk on that blackboard, what you find is that it's kind of roughly straight, but it's really not a straight line. Space and time doesn't have straight lines in it. To be a square, it has to have straight lines. Also, not perfect 90-degree angles on all sides. So this is a reminder, this image that he draws on the blackboard, this is a reminder here in the realm of space and time of the true square, which is up in heaven or up outside of space and time altogether. Right? When your geometry teacher draws a circle on the blackboard, it's never a perfect circle. The world down here doesn't have any perfect circles. That's what's wrong with the world down here. Whereas Plato's realm of the forms has a form of circleness, of the circular. And all the circles that we talk about, say on our geometry homework, or your children's geometry homework, or your grandchildren's geometry homework, or anybody's geometry homework ever since geometry got invented, well, all of these gesture at this final form. If they didn't, they would be all unintelligible to us. Also, think about the fact that geometry doesn't change. Next year's 10th graders, when they get taught geometry, are all going to learn exactly the same stuff. How do we account for this unusual stability of this kind of knowledge? because there's a form of the triangle and a form of the 7 and a form of the right angle, which stays the same. We just replicate that by gesturing at the idea. All right? Well, Plato thinks that it goes beyond mathematics. Not only is there a realm of the square, a realm of the 7, a realm of the triangle, he also thinks that there's a form of justice, a form of truth, a form of beauty. So when we go to an art museum and we look at a painting by Salvador Dali, and we look at a painting by Rembrandt, two paintings that have nothing in common except that they are paintings and they participate in the form of paintingness. Suppose we were to say about both of those paintings, those are both truly beautiful. An entirely possible reaction. Well, what do we mean by the Rembrandt portrait and some very bizarre construction by Salvador Dali? What do we mean when we say both of them are beautiful? What Plato thinks is that they both participate in some form of ultimate beauty, which is outside the realm of space and time. And that's how different kinds of things can be described as beautiful and have that be meaningful. It's like different size squares, or different squares, one drawn on a piece of paper, the other drawn on a blackboard, both participating in the form of squareness. This is Plato's ontology, which perfectly overlaps his epistemology. In other words, philosophers only construct ontological positions, and ontology just means the logos of being. It's the kind of the stratifications and different types of being. Well, once you go to the trouble of stratifying the different sorts of beings, you might as well construct various kinds of mental processes to get you in touch with those different kinds of things. So the ontology and the epistemology perfectly overlap. For the two least real kinds of things, images and objects of sense perception, you really can't know about that. All you get is opinion. For the most real kinds of things, mathematical objects and the forms, you get real knowledge. You perform mathematical deduction to find out the things, the objects of mathematical knowledge. And if you want to find out about the realm of the forms, you engage in the dialectic. This is crucial because this is what the Philosopher King is going to do. The Philosopher King is going to engage in the dialectic, which sounds like a very mysterious thing to do. The dialectic. It sounds like it should get a capital D, doesn't it? It's a very special kind of thing. No, it's not. The dialectic is just a very rigorous kind of conversation. In other words, you talk about it. And you talk about it seriously, and you talk about it step by step, and you honestly, with another person, try and figure out what's going on. So the dialectic, while it sounds terribly mysterious, is just the Philosopher King and his philosopher pals and the other people that are involved in the running of this society talking about the best way to do things. And they try and move, and to some extent they do move, up from this mere realm of flux and change and becoming to the realm of real knowledge. And this is the realm of the forms. So this logical doctrine is tied in with his earlier books 2, 3, 4, and 5. He constructs the ideal city, and then it breaks our heart we can't have the ideal city. But he doesn't want us to say, well, the ideal city was a waste of time. Exactly the opposite. The world of the senses is somehow fundamentally flawed, and that's what he's gesturing at here. It's not the fault of the theory, it's the fault of this world of rust and corruption. Things don't quite work here. This realm of unsquare squares, uncircular circles. What kind of world is this? Right? Not one that Plato's happy with. All right, now, as a way of making this visible, as a way of appealing, right, moving from logic, here, in the divided line I was telling you what the logical properties of this are. But in order to make this clearer to you, or if not clearer, make this more vibrant, more living towards you, more vivid, he offers us the myth of the cave. He says, think about this. I think he's talking to Glaucon at this point. He says, imagine people stuck in the bottom of a cave. There's an opening to the cave up in the front, and everyone that's in the cave has their head and shoulders chained so they can only look at a wall. And behind them there's a large fire, and men carry things between the fire and the wall so the people can't see them carrying these objects, and they look at the shadows cast by the fire and these objects on that wall and say, those shadows are reality. In other words, they are fundamentally mistaken in their ontological views. He thinks this is the whole pre- and non-philosophic group of all the world's people. In other words, everyone that doesn't understand the Platonic theory of forms is living in the realm of shadows because they believe in images and sense perceptions. They believe that these things are real. In fact, Plato says, until we learn philosophy, we are living in the realm of the senses, in the realm of space and time, in the realm of unreality. Now, the philosopher manages to liberate himself by means of dialectic and makes the slow and arduous journey up to the realm of the sun. Now, the people that get up to the realm of the sun, that make this arduous journey, see true reality, which would be analogous to the realm of the forms. And the sun is the form of the good. And you can't directly apprehend the sun, but the sun makes everything else in the world visible and possible. In some ways, it generates being, it generates knowability. It is the one unique, perfect, universal object which somehow generates the reality of everything else. So the form of the good, which is what the Philosopher King finds out about, is like the sun. Now, my view is that the reason why he doesn't go anywhere beyond the simile here is that the form of the good is fundamentally inexpressible. It's like talking about the fundamental nature or essence of God. It comes very close to that. In other words, if you can imagine God devoid of personality, the form of the good, which generates reality and being and allows the world to exist, has many qualities of the earlier sun god myths, but all the personality has been drained away from it. And now it's just a pure logical construct which somehow generates the thusness of things. Well, that's what the form of the good is, and the way in which we get to that is through dialectic, because that brings us to the knowledge of the forms, and we gradually climb up further and further towards the final form. But our journey of dialectic, and this is very important because Plato emphasizes in Book 6 the journey aspect of this, the journey motif, the journey of dialectic comes up again and again and again, and the point here is that the journey is asymptotic. We might actually be able to find out, get a tiny glimpse of the sun itself, but the difficulty is that language won't contain it. So at the end of the journey, Glaucon asks, all right, tell me about the form of the good. What's going on? What is the form of the good? And he says, Glaucon, I'd take you there if I could, son, but I can't. I mean, I've been up there, I've climbed the mountain, but you got to climb, the last stage you got to take yourself. Apparently, one goes beyond dialectic to I know not what. Maybe we don't ultimately get there. Maybe it's just an asymptotic move. But the idea is that human perfection, human virtue, human goodness is tied up with knowledge, and particularly knowledge of the form of the good. That's what's crucial. So the myth of the cave and the divided line are overlaps. One is a purely logical doctrine, an ontological and epistemological doctrine, which is instantiated in this myth of the cave and made political. So now what the philosopher has to do is come back down from the realm of reality to the realm of shadows, and of course he can't see his way around. I mean, it's a beautiful image, a perfect metaphor. I mean, what an inspired day when Plato thought this up. So he comes back down to the realm of the dark, and people laugh at him because he can't find his way around. But of course he's the only man that understands ultimate reality. This is the high point of the dialogue itself. In other words, when we walk up to the form of the good, when we get out of the cave, this is the high point of this dialogue. It's also the high point of Platonism. Right? This is Plato's theology, you might say. Right? The form of the good and the ideas themselves. Not only is Plato trying to revamp and refurbish all of Greek literature, but he's also trying to revamp and refurbish all of Greek religion. And he's invented a new religion. It's going to be transparently worship of the forms, and then we'll give them a personality. We'll say the form of bravery is a real brave guy that wears armor and stuff like that. He'll be like the old Ares, except that he won't have any of Ares' bad qualities. Why? Because he's a form. So in other words, what he's trying to do is supplant Homeric religion with a new Platonic religion, form worship. They're perfect. They don't really have personality, but we could probably think up a myth for you if you really need one. That is the key thing that the Philosopher King is going to have to be led towards the realm of the forms. That's why his study is going to be dialectical from the years 30 to 35. In other words, until he's 20, he's going to get the same gymnastic and music education as the regular ones, as the regular guardians. Then from 20 to 30, the education of the guardian will involve war, but also mathematics, because mathematics is our bridge up into the realm of the forms. So he's going to have to learn a lot of geometry. He'll be able to prove all kinds of great stuff. Anybody, incidentally, in the Platonic dialogues that has spent their time studying math or is caught studying mathematics, like Theaetetus, always a good interlocutor, always smart. It's always a sign that he's gotten a good education. If you're studying with the sophist, bad education, doesn't know any math. I mean, it always tips you off. So find out who taught someone. You'll always find out if his argument is any good before you even read it. Well, after some exposure to dialectic from 30 to 35, then the Philosopher King in training will go down and help conduct practical politics until he's 50 years old. Thereafter, if one has gotten the appropriate training and shown worthy of this philosophical education, you might be able to become a Philosopher King after the age of 50. So it's only for the old. And also I believe that the implications of Platonic feminism are that there will be philosopher queens too. In other words, I can't see how the body is going to make much difference. If they show that they're wise, courageous, moderate, and just, I don't think that sex is going to have very much to do with this. This is about souls and minds. This is not about bodies. So the key thing for the Philosopher King is that after 50, having gone through this enormous progress of dialectic and mathematics and all this education, he or she will have seen the form of the good, and having seen the form of the good, will be able to make decisions for the city and make sure that everyone is doing the right thing. But you need that knowledge of the form of the good. Elsewise, you are only legislating in your own interest or in whatever strikes your fancy. And that's going to lead to all kinds of complications, and that's going to lead to all sorts of degeneracy, and that's going to lead to all sorts of injustice. And injustice will, of course, cause the city to factionalize, and you'll get an internally incoherent city and an externally evil city. Right? Remember that you want to keep a unified soul and a unified city. And you want a harmonious soul between its various parts and a harmonious city between its various parts. The only way to do that is to subordinate all of them to knowledge, to this new Platonic hero of knowledge, the philosopher king, or in this case, instantiated as Socrates. Now, having come up to that point, we're now going to gradually be led down away from the realm of the forms. And what's going to be picked up next after the education of the philosopher king in Book 8 is the degenerate regimes. For each of the bad souls, and there are five kinds of souls, and 4 of them are bad. There's going to be 4 kinds of regime, and 4 of them will be bad, and one will be connected to the other. Those of you who know Nietzsche's book, The Genealogy of Morals, will find in Book 8 a genealogy of morals. Nietzsche was full of envy of Plato because he was the great educator of the West and wanted to supplant him. So many of Nietzsche's ideas that look real kind of new and kind of original are not new or original at all. Nietzsche was a philologist. So in Book 8 of the Republic, we get the first of the great genealogies of morals. And he explains how, if we were to ever have a philosopher king and a good city, how it would inevitably degenerate because this world of space and time is a mess. It doesn't work right. What would happen? Well, we would neglect education because education is the guardian of the guardians. Right? Education is what makes sure that the guardians behave properly. If they're not educated properly, the result is going to be that they're going to start to love honor rather than love knowledge. And that means that eventually the city will move into the first of its injustices, praising and valuing honor over knowledge. And then you're going to get something like the Spartan or the Cretan constitutions where honor, it's called the Timocratic constitution, where the man of honor supplants the man of knowledge. And since knowledge is virtue, and honor is sometimes not virtuous, if you think about Achilles, if you think about Odysseus or Agamemnon, honorable men are not always good men and often not knowledgeable men. So the first of the degenerate regimes will be the Timocratic regime, the regime of honor. That will break up because these honorable men do not know how to control their emotions. They do not know how to control their desires. And the necessary consequence of that will be an oligarchy, where a few men try and accumulate a great many pleasures. They'll get to control a lot of property, and they'll control a great many things that they would want. And they will work to satisfy the necessary pleasures. They will have some sort of self-discipline, but it will be a clear deterioration from the regime of the Timocratic man. The next degenerate regime after the oligarch, his son, will be the Democrat. He will want not unlimited, but he will want to pursue the unnecessary as opposed to the necessary desires. And that's true of the demos. That's true of most people. So the next stage down in our descent away from the good regime is towards democracy. So it goes from the ideal city to the Timocratic city to the oligarchic city to the democratic city. And then just below the democratic city, which is full of all kinds of pleasures and pains and miscellaneous emotions and a very unorderly, disorderly, un-Apollonian soul, we get the worst of regimes, the tyrannical regime, and the worst of men, the tyrannical man. And the tyrannical man is the one that wants to have as many desires as he can and to satisfy them as completely as he can, but this is a wretched life where your desires always outstrip your capacity to satisfy them. So you're constantly scratching itches, but you have many more itches than you can scratch. So you're constantly in a wretched state being pushed around by your feelings, never being able to organize your soul. And each of these 4 degenerate regimes corresponds to a phase of moral corruption. And because the city is like the man, right, is a main idea of the Republic, it is important to note 2 things. One, that our interlocutors in this book have been these kinds of men. This is often overlooked. It is clear enough that Socrates represents the philosopher king, the good man, the man of wisdom, however you want to put that. I mean, even leaving the irony in, there's no doubt that he's the morally best, most intelligent man in the dialogue. Number 2, the Timocratic man, Glaucon, is most brave in all things. Glaucon rushes in. Glaucon is interested in war. Glaucon is interested in sex. Glaucon has a really silver soul. He has many of the Homeric virtues, but also some of the Homeric vices. And Glaucon represents that next step down from Socrates. That's why he's most closely associated with Socrates in the dialogue. The Timocratic man has the greatest affinity to the philosopher. Why are they together at the very beginning? Because they have the most in common, and Socrates thinks that maybe I could make a philosopher out of this guy if I just bumped him another step up. His brother, Adeimantus, beginning of book 4, Adeimantus says, you know what, Socrates, I don't see how your rulers can be happy, since after all they don't get to have a lot of property and big houses and nice things like that. Glaucon is the oligarchic man who's interested in accumulating property. I mean, remember, he comes from Plato's family, he's Plato's brother, and they're a high-ranking family within Athens. I mean, they're an influential family. So Glaucon represents, at least initially, the oligarchic man. Now, in that beginning in book 1, when Polemarchus sends his slave to pull Socrates and say, look, stay here, Socrates. I mean, I'm going to hold on until Polemarchus gets here. And then they talk and say, look, there are a lot more of us than there are of you. This is about power and knowledge. Can you stay if we, can you leave if we won't listen to your persuasion? No. Well, then we'll have a vote and we'll all vote that you will come with us. Polemarchus is the democratic man, and that's why they have that vote. Nothing happens by accident in a Platonic dialogue. If somebody votes, it tells you something about them. If he loses something, whatever he's lost is symbolic of something. If he has to go somewhere and do something, whatever he's going to do, that's symbolic of something. Everything is symbolic. So when they have that little vote in the beginning, that's tremendously important because it tells you what kind of souls we're dealing with. We're in a democratic city, and Polemarchus, the guy who initiates this, is the democratic man. And it's not hard to figure out who the tyrannical man is. It's Thrasymachus, right, who says, justice is the advantage of the stronger, let's take control of the city and indulge ourselves. Now, here's what's really important. Not only do we get this decline in the degenerate regimes in book 8, but Socrates also gives us the key for moving back up the ladder. In other words, if you can climb down, you can climb up. The way you do it is by censoring the poets and by educating people by giving them access to good, morally uplifting poetry, like, for example, this. In other words, think about what's happened to our interlocutors now in the course of the dialogue. First is the end of book 5. At the end of book 5, Glaucon says, you know, Socrates, I made this great praise of injustice at the beginning of book 2 with the myth of Gyges, but now that you go through the argument and explain it to me, this is really stupid, and I'm really sorry I did this. I can see now that the only good is justice, and that a man's life would be wretched without it. And clearly enough, I'm really sorry for having said these bad things about justice. Injustice is clearly an evil thing. No one that understood what he was doing would do that. What does that mean? Our timocratic man, up we go. He has been uplifted by his interaction with Socrates. He has gotten an education. Not any kind of final knowledge, because he didn't get introduced directly to the form of the good, but he has clearly been morally and intellectually improved by this. Virtue is knowledge, and when he gets more knowledge, he improves in virtue. Up we go. Now his brother Adeimantus, who at the beginning of book 4, is really interested in property. He wants big houses and stuff. The beginning of book 6, Polemarchus says to him, whispers to him, Socrates hasn't explained the community of women and the abolition of private property. Glaucon, who used to be kind of timid and reserved and moderate and austere, walks out, because he's now the timocratic man. He's moved up a notch from oligarchic to timocratic. He says, Socrates, stand right there. I'm arresting you a second time. He's gotten brave all of a sudden. Why? Up we go. He's gotten ratcheted up from oligarch to timocrat. He says, now you're going to stand and answer our questions. Clearly, the kind of interaction that he has with Socrates, the good education that he gets, morally improves him. Polemarchus starts out as our democratic man in the beginning, and then he gets all kinds of, well, moderate and restrained and austere. And instead of directly confronting Socrates at that beginning of book 6, he goes to, or beginning of book 5, he whispers to Adeimantus. He's moved from being the democratic man to being the oligarchic man. Up we go. And what's great about that scene at the beginning of book 5, Thrasymachus says the only other thing that he says outside of book 1. He makes 2 statements. One, he says, I'll go with that, I vote with that, make it unanimous. We all want you to stand and explain the community of women in the 3 waves, Socrates. What has happened to Thrasymachus? He has moved from being the tyrannical man, he has been made a social animal, brought into our little political organization, and he votes. So now he's the democratic man. Up we go, up we go, up we go. Everybody gets improved. It's beautiful. And the city is like the man. We got 5 interlocutors, we got 5 kinds of city. We're golden here. I mean, the isomorphism between city and man is really beautiful. And this instantiates the thing that it's trying to explain to you, that good education will bring you up and bad education will bring you down. And when I first read this, I didn't know books could do stuff like that. I mean, that's one of the great things in Plato. I mean, if you read this book seriously, you occasionally get this landslide of information and landslide of coherence. And this is an example of that. When I first found this out 20 years ago, it just made my weekend. And this is the kind of thing you ought to be looking for in Plato. Everything is there for a reason. Well, we get these degenerate regimes, and we get the way to satisfy the problems generated by these degenerate regimes. And Book 9 looks at the soul of the tyrant and shows that the tyrant is wretched and miserable, and also takes a crack at Euripides. Socrates and Plato obviously hate Euripides, and who can blame them? I mean, those of you who know Euripides, I don't much care for these tragedies. And he goes after Euripides saying, look, he's a praiser of tyrants, which he is, and says that we don't need that kind of art in our good society. It makes tyrannical men even worse. It gives them the bad education that I've just shown you how to reverse. And then Book 10 is very important. He goes back to a recapitulation of his critique of the poets. Why? Because he shows that poetry is educational, and these dialogues are intended to be educational. And education can either teach you the truth or not. And if it doesn't teach you the truth, it makes you worse rather than better. And this is the source of all our political and moral evils, because all knowledge is virtue, and all ignorance is vice. So all our vices are really ignorance. What does that mean? That means that we're really going to have to double back and censor Homer, because when Homer speaks well, we'll bring him in, but when he doesn't speak well, out he goes. He tries to make our young men into Achilles, and they get wrathful and petulant and want to kill something. They want to become tyrants. That's no good. So he criticizes epic, and he criticizes imitators in general, comedies and tragedies in addition, because these imitations are less real than the realm of the forms which he has just explained to us, and the poets are ignorant of. So these ignorant instructors create ignorant students, and the result is ignorance and vice across the board. Now, this means that Socrates is going to be our new hero. Instead of epic slaughter, instead of tragic crime, instead of comic foolishness, we're going to have a new man with a new goal, a new telos. He's going to be the hero as educator, the hero as man of knowledge. This is a new and higher and finer ideal. But this man of knowledge, while he prefers logos to mythos, he prefers reasoning to poetic imagery, he understands that different people have different capacities. So when there's a need for a poetic image, he will be able to generate that. Consider the divided line, and then consider the myth of the cave. If you found the divided line hard to figure out, and I did when I read it, I don't know about you, go to the myth of the cave. You see it then. And then you can go back and read the divided line and go, okay, I see his point now, because the good is like the sun. Well, this willingness to offer both logos and mythos, preferring logos but willing to give mythos to those who need it as a kind of helping hand, is the way he closes the Republic. Remember that since Cephalus was the first interlocutor in this dialogue, we've had no mention of divine retribution at all. Also, it's true that Platonism is potentially a very dangerous medicine, that you don't want this to fall into just anyone's hands. Socrates never wrote a book. He has very grave doubts about the written word. So Plato, in writing these, finishes the Republic off, and like many of the dialogues, with a myth. The point being that he's going to put something like a child-proof cap on this dangerous medicine. Right? You don't want kids getting into this. Don't do this at home, kids. If you didn't understand the 300 pages of my discussion about the form of the good and the divided line and the perfect city and the education of the guardians, well, here's a scary story for you to finish off. Right? The myth of Ur. Ur was a good man and died. And for some reason, the gods allowed him to retain his own consciousness in the afterlife. And he saw that in the afterlife, bad things happen to bad people, and good things happen to good people. And when good things happen to good people, they get the reward of the blessed. They go to the Isles of the Blessed and they get all kinds of nice stuff. It's essentially heaven. And in Hades, bad things happen to bad people. The Homeric heroes are in Hades where they belong. And not only that, but these Homeric men, these bad men that have been sent to Hades, some of them wise up, some of them don't. You get their true nature, because after you get punished, you are forced to become reincarnated, and the life you choose is all up to you if you will but choose with wisdom. So the great Homeric heroes, they choose to be eagles, lions, predatory animals. The implication, of course, is that the ideals offered us by Homer are really bestial, inferior, subhuman, carnivorous and impressive in a certain kind of natural way, but less than human. The smartest of the Homeric heroes, Odysseus, great irony here, looks around, decides he doesn't want to be a hero anymore, but since he's the smartest of the Homeric heroes, he decides he doesn't want to be a hero either. He decides he doesn't want to be an animal and doesn't want to be a Homeric hero. He chooses the life of a quiet, private citizen. And he says, fine, I'm going to mind my own business, do what I ought to do, and I'm going to be essentially just in that Platonic sense, every man minding his own business. So Odysseus, the smartest of the heroes, gives up on this. Apparently we're able to teach Odysseus something because he's got some brains, but Ajax and Achilles, they become eagles and lions and stuff like that because they were subhuman to begin with. And everyone who was brought back into this life, when they're reincarnated, whatever life they choose, all right, is, although generated by this mythological process of reincarnation, is also up to you. In other words, he leaves the burden for choice and the burden of moral responsibility on the individual soul. So if you understood the 300-odd pages between Cephalus and the myth of well then he's told you something about souls, told you something about cities, and told you something about the way in which a virtuous man will behave and think and act. Told you to organize your soul, organize the chaos within. The chaos without is not your problem. If you didn't understand this, here's a scary story for you, kids. All right? The point is that Plato is the master of both logos and mythos. And although he demotes the poets, he does not drive them out completely. He harnesses the poets onto the team that's driving us towards virtue and towards political and moral order.